Thank you very much for coming out tonight and joining us for this Tech Talk. My name is Drew Dameron and I'm the library manager here at the club. For tonight's Tech Talk, we're very happy to be hosting authors of Leading Sustainably, Trista Bridges Bivens and Donald Eubank. Trista Bridges Bivens is a senior advisor with extensive experience in strategy execution topics ranging from international business development and organizational training and development to corporate strategy. She has worked across a broad spectrum of industries, including life sciences, consumer goods, digital technology, and financial services, as well as geographies from Europe to the Americas and Asia. Trista holds an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University, and BSE from the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. She is also our second vice president here at the club and chair of the Sustainability Task Force. Donald Eubank is a strategic planner with experience in the IT, finance, cloud computing, and media industries in Asia. He has worked with multinationals and startups, launching new divisions, product lines, and business services. Donald is a graduate of St. John's College's Great Books Program of Philosophy and Science. We'll begin tonight's event with a presentation from the authors, and then we'll open up for questions from everyone attending here and virtually once we're done. Everyone who's attending virtually, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and I'll share them with the speakers here on your behalf. Please also keep in mind, those attending virtually, as well as the recording that we'll have, is only picking up the audio from the microphone. So if you can, please utilize the microphones when you're asking questions, or we'll help restate the questions in advance so people can understand. After the Q&A, we'll have a book sale and signing to close out the event, and those attending virtually may also purchase a book to be signed and can pick it up at the library. If you would like to, please use the Q&A function and tell us your name and TAC number to reserve a copy. They're 4,200 yen, and the proceeds go towards supporting this Tech Talk speaker series. Thank you very much for coming again, and please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Hello, everyone. I think now we can click away from my face, finally. I'm just trying to see my face. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and also for those on the phone. What we want to do tonight is talk a little bit about how we came into this subject and this topic, how we met as co-collaborators on this book. This actually, it kind of all starts here. And so we're going to start here, and then we're going to talk to you a little bit about what we learned, right, in the process of writing this book and what's going on out there around the topic of sustainability, a very hot topic. Becoming less of a controversial topic, to be honest, than it used to be, I think. But there's a lot of really interesting things going on around this topic around the world. So this is actually a picture which probably everybody knows is Arisugawa Park. And this is actually, Donald and I didn't actually meet here, but we used to come hang out here after our kids were in a drama class together. And so in the drama class, we were kind of talking a lot about this topic and the world and politics. This was back in, I guess, 2016? 17. So I was a couple years in Japan, and as we know, I mean, politically the world is still tumultuous, but it was particularly tumultuous in 2017. And so we talked about that, and this topic of sustainability was really a topic that was important to both of us. And for me, it always kind of had been, as Drew mentioned, my background is very much exclusively a business background. I actually started working when I actually started working the first time. I used to do internships with GE when I was 18 and 19. When I graduated from undergrad, I worked for General Mills and I sold yogurt. And then I went to business school. And then when I moved to Europe, I was working with Coca-Cola's and I was working with Roche and all these massive companies. And I always kind of thought about the topic of, well, what's business's role to society? And at that point in time, it was very much, there were benevolent things that were maybe done, but nobody really thought about that topic in the context of what a company does. That's a very different topic, right? So we talked a lot about this, and we said, well, why don't we kind of join forces? And so one of the first ideas we came up with was, well, what can we do to help businesses kind of navigate this? And so we thought about this idea of having an advisory firm, or at least having a research firm where we could kind of dig into this subject and we could kind of give businesses interesting insights. But out of that, we really said, well, why don't we write a book? Which is kind of a strange thing to do, right? Well, why don't we write a book? And for us, it was really a way to understand, right, what's going on around the world. We didn't want to limit this to Japan, and we didn't want to limit it to the US, so we took a completely global perspective. And we went out and we talked to about 100 thought leaders around the world across various sectors and across many companies, both large, both small. We spoke to policymakers, we talked to NGOs, anyone you could possibly imagine. And when we set out to do this at first, we said, well, will people actually talk to us? Because again, my background is in business and I'm used to businesses not wanting to talk about this topic. But what we found was actually at that time, and I think it's accelerating now, companies actually want to talk about this. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and we'll talk about those as we go through. Another thing that really inspired us was the SDGs. Does everybody know, raising hands, everybody know the SDGs? I assume everybody knows Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, great. Has anybody actually worked with them in any capacity? Okay, great, a couple people. And we'll talk a little bit later about them, but for us, we felt like this was an important part of the story. And it wasn't so much because we felt that all of a sudden things changed because the SDGs came out. But what they did do really well was they really broadened the topic of sustainability, right? Up until that point, it had meant climate, right? It had meant environment. But the SDGs really deal with lots of different challenges. They deal with what are all the things that we need to tackle to make a decent society, right? But businesses, we found, actually really liked the SDGs, and this was a bit of a surprise for us too. But we'll talk a little bit later about why that was. So we want to start first with, so just quickly, I think another click. Okay, that's a book. And so this is basically where we ended up. We wanted to start with, well, why is this a topic in the first place? Why does anybody care about this? What's going on? And the story really starts here from our perspective. And this was the financial crisis of 2008. I think that all of us lived through that time, and it affected us in different ways, and it affected regions in very different ways as well. I can't really speak so much to Japan because I wasn't in Japan at that time. I was in Europe. And I'm American. I was born in the US, but I lived in France for a long time and also have French nationality as well. And this was an absolute, for Europe, a complete disruption in every possible way. So not only did it put a lot of people out of work, not only did it increase a lot of precarity in these societies, but it changed the mindsets, I think, of Europeans around whether the system they were living in was doing what it was supposed to do. The same thing kind of happened in the US, but maybe with a different outcome or different result, but it was really the same issue. And the bankers and the financiers were really the ones who were considered the bad folk. But out of this, there started to be a discussion around, again, what is business's role to society? What should they be doing? What's their responsibility? So then we started to see lots of problems as well. This graph, which you probably can't see too well, but basically it's EU wage shares shrunk. So, in terms of how much money is going to people. This next one is increased gains widely shared in early post-war decades are not shared since. So this gap between the very wealthy and the poor widening. And I think we all, we can kind of debate a lot about our system and whether it's good to have a capitalist system or a more socialist system or these types of things. But I think it's pretty apparent that whatever system we had at that time and what we've had since is not really working as was initially conceived to, right? And so this kind of fueled the discussion around businesses and how much should businesses be contributing to fixing this problem. Millennials, which I think, as we know, it's kind of funny that people talk about millennials being kids because the oldest millennials now are about 40. So there used to be a time when a 40-year-old was not a kid. Apparently today that's a bit different. But millennials just have less capital to spend. They have less money to spend. And a lot of that is because costs have risen. And so the cost of housing, the cost of food, everything has really gone up proportionally. I think now if you look at what people spend on housing, for example, it's about 30% of people's incomes. This percentage used to be 10%. So they're really coming into an environment that's a little more difficult for them to succeed in. And also in millennials, I'll say outside of Japan, there's a lot of them, right? So in terms of their numbers, the weight of the size of the millennial population versus the baby boom population, they're pretty equivalent, I think, as I understand. So their voice is starting to have a lot more power now. And at the same time, we saw temperatures rising. So all of these things are coming together. People are starting to see more climate events. People are starting to get a little bit more upset about that. In the midst, their social systems kind of falling apart. We start to also see younger and younger people getting involved. These are two movements which you probably know. You probably know Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for the Future. huge movements that really have taken over the world, at least up until the most recent time, which I'll come to in a moment. Black Lives Matter as well last summer, which was, almost an earthquake, and we probably could add Me Too on this too. So the social systems that we have, our social relationships with each other are also not functioning. And then on top of that, we have COVID, which has just made everything that much more worse, but also more transparent at the same time. And so what we've heard, we did a short survey on this last year actually, and we found that a lot of businesses started to feel that COVID is a key part of this story. And perhaps part of the reason that we kind of got into this mess in the first place was because maybe we weren't thinking about sustainability in a broad way and taking action on it. So our slides are a little slow, sorry about that. Okay. So what are some of the things that I talked with some people earlier on about kind of some of the things that are really causing businesses to start taking action on this topic of sustainability. So first of all, core values. What's happening, we're seeing is the makeup of companies is starting to change, right? And so we're starting to see a lot of these younger generation people coming in the companies. They're really challenging the values of these companies. We actually talked to a few HR directors, and all of them said in interviews, including in Japan, they talk to young people and they say things like, I want to work for a company that shares my values. Can you tell me what you're doing on various topics around climate? I mean, it's incredible that people are asking these questions. They're not the questions that we would have maybe asked 20, 30 years ago of, well, what's the career path that I can take and what kind of training might I get? They're really concerned about the values of these companies. New opportunities, we're starting to see more and more consumers around the world that actually care about this and are starting to kind of put their money where their mouth is. So while it's not all consumers, there's enough of them now where this is starting to become a real topic. New leadership, again, we're starting to see a shift in terms of who are running companies. Some of these leaders can be a little bit controversial, but you may have seen today Elon Musk, who is kind of always trying to set the tone for many things, decided that they were no longer going to accept Bitcoin as payment for Teslas. They announced last year that they were. And the reason was that there's some thinking that that Bitcoin mining actually is not a very good activity for the climate, right? That it draws on a lot of energy, a lot of dirty energy. And so that I think is, whilst these new leaders are can be very controversial, they also are very values driven in terms of how they run their companies, right? And we're starting to see some interesting moves from them as well. Slowing growth, this is another thing too. So we have to look for new markets, but we also get more pressure, right, when growth is slowing, and it raises the question of why is growth slowing? Investor pressures, investors have really taken up this topic. You may hear a lot about ESG. They're seeing it as very risky for companies to focus on this topic. So they have really been a key pain point actually for a lot of companies. And you have companies like, or investors like BlackRock and such, who have been very activist in trying to get companies to change. Again, risk management, I talked a little bit about that. How can we mitigate the risk of our companies? We see in the future, for example, that climate's going to become more of an issue. Regulatory pressure, particularly in the EU, there's lots of regulations around this coming online. And then again, changing customers and consumer attitudes. So what are a couple interesting things we're seeing? So I talked a little bit about what's happening with these new people, younger people coming into companies. In the US, where you have a lot of research, actually, it's probably one of the best places in the world to kind of get this regular research about this topic, because there's a lot of universities, for example, who are working around this. And so what we've seen is that 64% of millennials basically won't take a job if the employer doesn't have corporate responsibility type practices, right? That's kind of a very broad term. But what they actually have today, which I think is a little different than before, is options. So they don't have to work for a massive corporation anymore. They can work for small companies. They can work for startups. They can maybe try to shape the agenda more. And especially if they don't think they're going to have a job in the long term anyway, why not? Why not take a risk and go somewhere else? There might be it might be a better fit with their values and also a better opportunity long term. So a lot of large companies are finding it challenging actually to bring these types of employees in. And also I would say is that this doesn't shift so much in bad times and good. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because usually you would think if the market's bad, then they just want a job. If the market's good, then they go somewhere else. But that's not so much what's happening, because a lot of the growth within economies is not necessarily coming from large companies anymore. It's coming from often smaller businesses. 66% of Americans would switch from a product they typically buy to a new product that's purpose driven, right? So this is something also that's a bit vague. We don't really understand if this is really the case or what does that actually mean. But what it means is that when they're standing at a shelf or they're making a decision, they are starting to think about this and they are starting to spend money around it, right? So many companies you see, particularly a lot of consumer products companies, have bought up sustainable brands. You see, we're going to talk a little bit later about B corporations and what those are. It's a really interesting area where we're starting to see a lot of interesting change on the consumer side of things. I want to just flip through this very quickly to give a little bit of background around how we actually got here. And I'm not going to spend very much time on this, but many people in this room might remember the divestment movement. There was some divestment activities around various things, particularly investment in South Africa many years ago. During our apartheid, and this really kind of accelerated the idea of companies have a responsibility, and perhaps we should look at not investing in them or not patronaging them if they are not sustainable. The Bruntland Report, this came out actually in the late 80s. This was interesting because what it did was really say, okay, what is business's responsibility and what does development mean? And this was really saying that development is about meeting the needs of society. It's not just about focusing on a few, and we should be thinking about future generations and defining that as well, right? So it really kind of broadened the view around these particular topics. ASG has become very popular here in Japan, but it actually dates back to the 80s. So we started to see some initial action around this then. At that time, and similar a little bit to Japan today, it focused a lot on governance. So this is a period of time when we started to see change in terms of what does a good board look like in a company. We started to see a lot of change around that. Cannibals with Forks is a book by a gentleman named John Elkington, who people might know. He was the first one that really kind of said, okay, this triple bottom line, that when companies should focus on people, planet, and purpose. So he really said that these three things should be on an even plane for a company. He still writes. He just had a book that he released last year called Green Swans to talk about this transition. But very interesting gentleman who continues to be a real thought leader on this topic. The Prius, 1997, this was actually a bit of an earthquake for the auto industry. And at that time, it wasn't necessarily, I think we would say, a fantastic car, but I think now we would say that, you know, hybrid technology and now electric vehicles are really becoming standardized. And at that time, it was really an exceptional thing to have a Prius. But now it's something that's becoming much more commonplace. And then the framework that preceded the Sustainable Development Goals was the UN Millennium Development Goals. And those were a bit different because they focused really on countries and particularly emerging markets. But the concept was so strong, and there were actually only 8 of them, that it evolved eventually into the SDGs in 2015. And we have 17 SDGs, which is a lot. But I think very important. And then the B Corp, which is really kind of how do we embody what John Elkington was saying, right? How do we embody companies that bring these 3 things into balance? And how do we certify them and make sure they're actually doing that? And where we're at in this point in time is this. We're trying to kind of come up with ways to validate, to test companies, and to ensure that they are doing this. So the B Corporation certification is one that was a slow time coming, but now has actually become very popular. And then, of course, the Tesla Roadster, which is, you know, the first idea of let's have an electric vehicle that is also something people like to drive. Okay, so up until this point, we had a lot of products that were sustainable but weren't necessarily enjoyable to use, right? This was actually a bit of an important inflection point, because now if you talk to anybody developing sustainable products or goods, they aim also to make them something people want to eat, some people want to use, that they're attractive, that they're designed well. So design has really come into the top tech of sustainability. And then also fair trade, which I forgot to mention at the top, very important change as well. Okay, and so this is basically the SDGs, which I think everybody, we talked about a little bit earlier, and they really have been a way of, I think, articulating really well what we're up against. So there's a lot of things on this slide. 17 is a whole lot, but companies really like them. And the reason companies like them is that they can find themselves in them. So if you're looking to improve, you're a convenience store and you're looking to improve, SDG 12 speaks really well to you, right? You can immediately say, well, maybe the way we package things, maybe all of the items that we immediately throw away if they're, one day about to expire, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe we need to come up with ideas to address that problem. Or if you're a healthcare company, 3, good health and well-being is really interesting to people. Now, I should say beneath these 17 goals, there's incredible numbers of targets that sit beneath these. We won't go into these, but this was kind of something that we felt was important to address and talk about in the book as well. So we touch upon that topic too. So what does this mean? What do companies need to do to be able to be more sustainable? So in addition to a lot of the things that we uncovered around what's going on with companies, we also thought through, okay, how can we kind of explain what companies are going through? And this is really kind of what we call the 5 steps of sustainable business model. And it starts really with base level understanding and then goes into the C level because it's very difficult for companies to change anything without that level of engagement. It needs to kind of come at the top, and that's where it starts. They tend to also take first actions and wins. So they start small often, and then they kind of advance. They do a couple good things, and then they try to generalize that across the organization. And then, of course, everything's aligned, right? So your finance department, your accounting department, your marketing department, all believe this is important. It's integrated into your business model. You're really ready to go. However, most companies we talk to are nowhere near the top, and that includes many of the ones that we know today. So we talk to companies like Coca-Cola, we talk to H&M, we talk to Citibank, HSBC. In Japan, we spoke with, who did we speak with? We spoke with many, Satsui House, Sony, all of these companies doing incredible things, but nowhere near the top, right? All the companies we spoke to, and most companies have a very long way to go to get there. So we try to kind of give some ideas for how they can get there. There have been some companies, though, that do really well on this. And one of the ones we spoke to, which we have a profile about in the book, is a company called Keen. And Keen, which I think many people may know here, it's a footwear company. It started in the late 90s. The thing that's really fascinating about them are just 2 things that I'll point out. First of all, something like 35 to 40% of their production is actually done in their own factories. And in the apparel industry, that's extremely rare. So a company like H&M, it's only 1%. Okay, so why is this important? Obviously, things like labor rules and worker rights and that type of thing is very good, but they can also test things in their own factories, which they can then try to extend to their contract manufacturers. So this is what they try to do. And one of the things that they use is a framework called the Higg Index. And in the apparel industry, this was developed actually, interestingly, by Patagonia and by Walmart. 2 very different companies that you wouldn't expect to come together on anything. They came together and said, let's come up with a framework to help different contract manufacturers all around the world be more sustainable. And that it's on labor rights, that's on how they deal with waste, that's on everything that you can imagine, all the problems that apparel has. Okay, and so Keen is one of the companies that's really trying to kind of push this system, right? And they very much are an advocate for it, and they work with their contract manufacturers to help them. The 2 places that they're focusing on, they have their factories are in Thailand and in the US, and then they also work with China, obviously, and Cambodia. Then there's also a lot of smaller companies that are doing some very interesting things as well, and we highlight some of these in the book. Everything from the one on the top, which is taking fabric and kind of breaking it down to its components. E-Concrete, which is actually an incredible company, and they develop sustainable concrete that doesn't affect ocean shorelines. A lot of the problems we have are actually construction oriented, using cement, for example. They try to make sure we can use materials that don't destroy biodiversity, but help to regenerate it. Unfortunately, and it's very sad, the founder, which we knew and we interviewed, she just passed away in March. But the company is an Israeli company. They continue to win awards, and they're going to keep going. But she was an incredibly brilliant biologist, marine biologist actually, who developed this technology. Ricci Everyday is a Japanese company, and actually it's based in Uganda. And the fascinating thing about them is they actually provide benefits to their employees, which is almost unheard of. Things like retirement income, healthcare coverage, almost unheard of, right? So they develop the bag sustainably, but they also have a sustainable model for their employees. And then finally, Renewable, which is based in New York City, and they're developing fertilizer that can be used in organic farming, right? That's basically using food waste to develop that particular fertilizer. And I think that's it from me. Yes, this is Donald.
Hand over the baton to me.
Sorry.
Leave me with all the hard slides. So Trista mentioned the B Corporation before, which is essentially, it's more of a movement than a framework that you see with a lot of ESG sort of methods for making companies think about their environmental social impacts. Those, you may have heard some of them, SASB or others, but the B Corp is an attempt to get companies to think harder about the choices they make from the start, or if they're existing businesses, to think about the practices they do today and how they can change them. There is an online free assessment you do that is a bit onerous. There's many questions about many dimensions that maybe you wouldn't have thought of. So part of it is making you aware of all the things that would need to be done if you wanted to become a sustainable organization, and part of it is to just show you the range of what they are. But there's a lot of household names up here. Ben & Jerry's, Patagonia are two of the oldest companies that have gotten the assessment. There's a lot of new businesses that were started from the beginning, such as Lemonade or Allbirds, which is a shoe company that were aligned like the mission-driven companies that Trista was just describing. So for them, in a sense, it would be easy for them to get the certification. But it could become a standard for businesses just to prove that they are sustainable. If I see B Corp now, I know it's a business that I can do business with and not have to think about whether they're having negative impacts on society. Now, one thing that a lot of those companies are already aligned with is the circular economy, because rather than designing their business for the old model of a linear economy, which is take, make, throw away, they're trying to keep things into the circle. So the 4 R's are big here: reduce, reuse, recycle, and I missed one. Reduce, reuse, refurbish, recycle. The nice thing about the circular economy, it's been a well-developed concept by the MacArthur Foundation together with McKinsey, although there's other versions of it, is that it takes not only a technical view on how to deal with materials and how to determine what to use in situations where you have a problem, such as plastics, which a lot of big companies are dealing with, but it also can give you an economic view on how to reduce your costs by looking upstream at your suppliers and how you're actually sourcing your products. It's a bit technical, but it really is fundamental to achieving the sustainable business model. Another thing that we just we noted sort of after the book came out, we paid more attention to it, was that you really have to start with the board. We know that you have to start with an executive that makes bold choices and communicates them well to the company. But if the board is not putting pressure on the company, or if the board itself doesn't understand these sustainability issues, it will be very difficult to make progress. Companies may hire in these other levels people who are their sustainability officer, but if they're not empowered by the executives or powered by the board to take action, it's not going to get anywhere. And you may have employees coming in that are, as Trista described, have a different orientation from the start and different expectations for your business, and they will put pressure on the companies. We're hearing that a lot, and they're forcing companies to change, but the top has to decide that this is something that they buy into. So one thing we're very interested in right now is how to help boards become more educated on these issues, because the reality is a lot of them, despite the fact that their job is protecting company from long-term risks, don't have enough knowledge right now about physical risks or about transition risks in the market, where a company that did business in a way that was unsustainable may be replaced in 5 years by a company that does things in a completely different way. Think about a fossil fuel company versus a solar power company. So boards need to really start to educate themselves better about this. And when they do, then they pass that on down and they give executives KPIs and departments KPIs. And with those KPIs, it hits your wallet, you're going to start making decisions that are going to make you more sustainable. So we talk a lot about the business case when we talk to businesses about this, because the big obstacle to getting people to think about this is to see it as more than just some sort of hassle that they have to deal with. NGOs or regulators asking them to do a little bit more work. We try to show them that there's an opportunity to be made here, and that by investing in sustainability, they're not actually going to impact their bottom line in a negative way. They'll probably impact it in a positive way. So I just want to take a macro view of this, which is looking at a country level. This is showing that over the course of more than 10 years, the GDP of the United Kingdom continued to go up while they made efforts to reduce their emissions. So if we're just looking at carbon going into the atmosphere, their efforts to stop that by becoming a more sustainable country did not impede the growth of GDP. Now, there is probably a fair portion of these emissions here that were not actually done from energy efficiency activities within the country or the replacement of fossil fuels with solar. It was probably production being offshored, going to China or Vietnam or to Thailand, and that actually reduced their in-country emissions. But businesses, countries, actually the EU in particular, are probably going to start thinking about that with something called the border adjusted mechanism, the carbon border adjusted mechanism, which will be essentially a tax on products that come into the EU that have a higher emission level than products that are made in the EU. So for comparison, we can look at Japan, and you see Japan, not as much GDP growth and not as much decarbonization, but the same pattern, that they were able to continue growth without having a negative impact from reducing their emissions. But Japan has more that they can do, especially in the energy space. Not enough penetration from renewables here, so hopefully that will pick up. I don't want to get too much into the whole question about carbon emissions in the atmosphere, but this is a big global view of it, and you see that we have land and the ocean will absorb almost 41% of the carbon that is emitted into the atmosphere, but there's another 59% that remains. And the majority of that comes from these industries: electricity production, food and agriculture, industry, transportation, buildings. And these are all industries that Japan has been a leader in different ways that contributes globally to these emissions going out. And with the new commitments from Suga, hopefully what we'll see are regulations in place that actually start to encourage these companies to consider how they themselves in their core activities can innovate around their products and services to reduce the emissions that they're contributing. And I really believe that they have to, because in the EU, that's what companies are doing. And in the market, they will be rewarded, and companies that don't are going to suffer for it. So we just wanted to end with the future of sustainable business. And the things that we started investigating and researching 4 years ago are still the same, but at the same time, they're evolving very rapidly. And one thing we did in the book was we wrote a little prologue from a fictional point of view of an executive in the year 2030, which is the due date for the SDGs, looking back on the business planning decisions that he made or she made in the previous 10 to 15 years and seeing how it played out. And the assumption here is we got somewhere towards what the targets were of the SDGs, and we ended up somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming, or the path towards that, towards 250. So I'm going to do something I haven't done before, which is read a short book excerpt here, just from the end of that.
It's very much, I said, like LeVar Burton reads.
Yes, yes. Well, I feel like it's story time at home, but okay. So imagine this is 2030. Recently, in fact, I can't help but notice that we don't talk about sustainability as much as we used to. I think it's become so ingrained in the way that we do business that being sustainable is sustainable with being a business. It is synonymous with being a business. Compared to 15 years ago, back when the 2030 Agenda business plan was launched in 2015, we're in a far better place. The company is healthier and better positioned to survive for another 15, 30, 50 years. We are more certain of our positive contributions to society, and our organization has renewed vigor and a more secure social license to operate, as they say. There's less uncertainty in our business planning activities, and it's become easier to make business decisions because we can base them on material issues on which we have a deep and sophisticated understanding and line of sight. Making the change wasn't always easy, but I can say today that for business, for my career, and for my own sense of satisfaction, and for my knowledge that we are serving society in a meaningful way, it was the right path to take. I look forward to continuing this journey in 2031 and beyond. The optimistic view. Yeah. And that's it. So we welcome your questions, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please go ahead and come up to the microphone here and pose it.
Hi, Adam Handler. So you mentioned BlackRock and sort of net zero investing, and I read in New York Times that the TIA said net zero investing by 2030. When I hear that, it sounds sort of gimmicky to me. But are those sort of things real, and what does that really mean for like an investment house like TIA or BlackRock to be doing net zero investing?
Well, it's complex for them. We heard a story recently where they were investing. They were deciding not to invest in a company because it was sourcing from a plantation that had practices that didn't. The P&G.
Yeah.
They were sourcing.
BlackRock.
Were you telling me this?
Yes.
Okay. I should let you tell.
They were so basically BlackRock. What they're trying to do is you can imagine they're basically looking at all their investments and trying to invest in companies that are taking action to reduce their carbon, right? So all their investments are in holdings that are focusing on getting to net zero. That's basically kind of what that's looking like. However, here is the problem that has. So in this case, BlackRock decided to vote against. I guess there was some resolution with P&G to kind of protest the fact that P&G was investing in, or they basically were doing activities with a palm oil plantation. And this palm oil plantation is not really terribly sustainable. There's something called sustainable palm, which there's a lot of debate about whether it's actually sustainable. But in any event, this one is not a good actor. So BlackRock voiced their opposition. However, at the end, they found out that BlackRock actually held the same investment in this plantation via mutual fund holdings. So the reason that this is really complex is I can kind of really control what I invest in directly, right? I can screen it, I can take a look at it, I can have active conversations, for example, with the company and the fund. But when they actually have holdings in other funds that may therefore have holdings somewhere else, it gets to be extremely complex. So in theory, the theory is they are really trying to put their money into companies that make these same net zero commitments. They go through their supply chain, they remove any carbon issues from their supply chain, right? But it is absolutely, it's not so much gimmicky, it's just incredibly difficult to do at this point in time.
And I think commitments are great though. I mean, I'm always happy to see a commitment. I'm always happy to see a target. What that does is draws attention to the activities that the company is promising to do, and then now we all watch them. What the company has to do next, though, is put mechanisms into place that help them to achieve that commitment that they've made, and we need to see them taking actions to do that. But there's also a transparency that's coming about now, so that whether it's an NGO or it's other investors or it's businesses, they're going to follow up that company and say, well, are you making progress on what you've stated?
Yeah. And one last thing I'll say, you might have heard a lot about carbon offsets, right? So carbon offsetting, and carbon offsetting doesn't eliminate the problem, right? It offsets the problem. So now the push is to really use technologies or change in practices that actually removes the carbon, and then use offsetting if you cannot do so without the actual technology and innovation approaches and change in how they operate.
And the last thing I'd add is also that beyond whatever commitments they're making internally, the EU is a big leader on this. There are regulations being put in place in terms of disclosing the activities that you're doing. So I think a lot of this might be preparing for that so that they're not going to have to adjust when it happens and they can start to get ahead of that. But when those regulations come in place, again, it'll be easier to know whether or not they're actually meeting those commitments.
Another question?
Sure.
So one of the things I'm always concerned about is to what extent is this first world and rich man issues or rich person issues? I'm always reminded of the statement by Boutros Ghali when he was head of the UN, talking about nobody cared about Somalia. They only cared about the bourgeois war in Bosnia. Is that, to what extent do these sort of policies actually hurt economic growth in places like Africa and, you know, the South Pacific Islands and things like that in South America?
Well, I mean, we see the SDGs as a treasure trove of opportunities. So what they're identifying are problems that exist in these communities that there could be business solutions for. In a sense, what they're showing you are underserved communities. So I think that they come from that space of no one left behind, and they're made in consensus with all the nations of the world. I mean, there are massive negotiations to come to the conclusion of what they are. So if you're looking at it from the SDG perspective, no, I don't think it's a first world white man savior coming in to help these countries and then inflict some sort of economic damage accidentally. Sustainability more broadly, I think that it's people are going to learn what works and learn what doesn't work. But we have actually some really good examples with Novo Nordisk about how they actually help communities, because they see that if they go into communities that have almost no economies at all, they can create economies there that in the end become their customers. So there's an economic interest for them, but they're also creating platforms for these communities to sort of rise up from.
And I would say a couple of things too. So if you look, we talked about the SDGs and how they cover these 17 areas, and they covered things like gender equality, education, health and wellness. And those communities, the biggest issues with those communities is that, you know, arguably, I'm not saying that aid isn't important, right, for emerging markets, but they're in many ways band-aid solutions. You know, what those economies need are education on the ground. So more, you know, for example, young girls can get educated, and therefore they can kind of, help the society overall to increase in terms of its GDP and in terms of its viability, right? In terms of health and wellness, getting people healthier and having functioning health systems really helps economies develop. So it's not just, so I agree. I think the way we think about sustainability now, it's not just solar panels, you know, it's really trying to tackle all these issues that are holding these societies back. And that's what they were aiming to do, but to do so in a durable way through creating kind of functioning economies and societies. And then one shift that actually is happening, which is kind of an interesting one, is that some of the companies that we talk to are changing how they think about people in these markets. So previously, they would talk about helping the communities, as opposed to now they think about our customers in those communities or partners in these communities. And that's a difference. And that's probably happening because, and this is, of course, arguably prior to COVID, which may change things a bit for a period of time, but the income levels in these countries are rising, which means that they have an ability, right? And I think that that's the thing. I don't think it's preying on these markets, but companies look at people a different way when they're a customer than when they're helping them, right? So this is also changing, I think, a little bit about how they look at those markets and what their role is in those markets and the type of partnerships that they should be doing in those, you know, parts of the world.
Yeah, and I could just add on to that one quick thing. I think they're also recognizing some of the damage they were doing, and some of it was coming through charity, for example. People thinking, well, let's take our old clothes and send it to Africa, but then that has a negative impact on the economies there. because no one's going to be
They're
making
drowning in
new
old clothes.
No one's going to be making new clothes because they just got this free stuff coming in, so they don't build up their own industry. So things like that are starting to be recognized because they're rethinking what their relationship is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got a question from someone attending us virtually. This is from Marissa. Do you think a lot of companies are sincere with their intentions? I feel as a consumer, I am being greenwashed. Any thoughts or tips?
I think that's a very good point. I think with some companies you are and some companies you are not. So I think the company that we talked about, Keen as an example, I think that they are actually authentic. And part of the reason I'd say they're authentic is they do some things, I didn't talk about this when we talked, but that actually are kind of counterintuitive to their business model. So for example, when you buy their shoes, they actually make them with components that can be replaced. So you can call them up, they can send you a new component so you can fix it yourself. You can send your shoes back to be repaired. And that's actually very interesting because that's not a consumption-driven model in the way we think about it. Durability in construction and in design is incredibly important in sustainability, making something that lasts. And so I would say with that type of company, no, you're not. However, if there's a company like, I don't know, green cigarettes, right? Or, people who throw the label of sustainability over everything, yes. But there actually are new technologies coming online now to be able to try to get past a lot of that. So I know in Europe, I talked with a couple startups that have these, these apps where you can scan a product that can kind of tell you actually how much carbon, it can estimate roughly how much carbon they produce. We can talk a little bit about where they came from, what's their origin. And I think transparency and having technology to have more transparency into these problems will help a lot. But yes, absolutely. I think that there is certainly some of that. I think we have to say there's some of that going on, but that doesn't mean we should stop doing it. That means we should do a better job of helping to kind of figure out what best in class looks like and make sure that happens in other places.
Thank you. Any other questions from the room? Yeah, please.
Shunsaku Sato. So something like carbon neutral is very easy to understand, and politicians and corporate leaders say we're going to aim for carbon neutral. Then when you think about the batteries, powers required, the solar panels, it takes rare earth or lithium and cobalt and all other minerals to create. So how do you measure the I would say the consequence or the cost, environmental cost of producing the materials that's necessary to achieve carbon neutral, and whether it's in fact net better than what we have now?
Okay. Well, I think we have fairly sophisticated methodologies now for carbon footprinting production of products and sourcing of materials. And I think that we're fairly capable of forecasting what the replacement of one technology with the other one would look like. So I believe in the balance, you'll be able to make that calculation. And what you'll see is as soon as you remove fossil fuels, even if you're starting to take out a different resource, the amount of emissions are going to go down. Now, you're going to have to, of course, make sure that by replacing fossil fuels with rare earth elements, that you're not actually creating a new problem. But if you're just looking from the perspective of the goal of the Paris Agreement, you're going to be contributing to a solution rather than continuing business as usual, which is not working. But yeah, I mean, do you want a follow up about the sourcing of the materials? Is there a particular concern that you have?
Well, it's just difficult to measure those consequences. We don't know, where they come from. So when it's just we don't know. We don't know if it's net better or worse.
I think as well, I think there's a lot of people working on that problem in two ways. One is the traceability, and certainly technologies like blockchain are trying to address that, so we can see where all those components are coming from. The second is innovation in having longer lasting batteries. That's actually a really important change. And there's quite a few companies working around that at the moment. And there's a lot of reasons for that, even things like ensuring that we have like battery powered solar electricity, right? You need to have batteries that last a long time and that are very durable. So I think not having batteries that are disposable in a short period of time will help quite a bit actually with this problem. And then the last thing is you probably know about tech companies now that are going totally carbon neutral or carbon, I guess, negative by 2030. So Apple, for example, has announced this. That will be incredibly important because, like I said, they can't just offset to get there. They're going to have to put a lot of pressure actually on all of their suppliers to help them get there too, if they ever get there. So actually all these commitments that the tech companies or tech related companies are making will be a big help actually to that as well. And they have a lot of power, right? A company like Apple has a massive amount of power in their supply chain to enact change. So if they're serious about it and they actually do it, then that will help too.
And I think as well, if you take that circular economy approach to it, in this case, when you're pulling these resources out of the ground, you're going to make sure that you keep them in use as long as possible. But with fossil fuels, you burn it once and it's gone out, and then you need to get more. So you don't have that fundamental circularity to it from the start. So I think the awareness we have of the problems that were caused are probably going to guide us in making sure that the decisions we make with these new materials are better than what came before.
And I would say just the last kind of point is that, a lot of things that we use at the moment, a lot of technologies, a lot of it are not ideal at the moment. Right? And I talked about blockchain before as an example. This doesn't mean that we necessarily stop doing them. It means that we find a way to do it where they're not as damaging. And some things we might have to stop doing eventually, and maybe we will. Maybe we'll find a solution that's better. But there are a lot of people trying to work on these problems. People who are much smarter than me around these technologies. So I'm sure that it'll be very difficult and very expensive. But I think there are a lot of people now working on it, and there's more investment as well. That's another important thing. There's a lot more investment going into climate technologies than ever before. So that's actually going to be a game changer, I think, for this particular sector.
Thank you. We've got one question from someone online. Should SDG audits be done in the future, and should there be standardization?
Yes. We always talk about this, but people need to start treating this like they do finance, right? You wouldn't, if you were, you're an investor in a company and the company says, oh yeah, we made 2 million last year, and then gives you nothing to prove they made 2 million. Like, why would you believe that? And I think this is, we need to start taking it as seriously as we take money, basically, because, ultimately it has an impact on money. So yes, I think absolutely. There's a lot of standardization that needs to happen. There's too many frameworks. They all say different things. Companies can kind of cherry pick what they like. We need to get away from that and get to something that's a little bit more standardized, like we have with financial statements, right? We don't have financial statements that are structured tons of different ways. This is a similar issue, I think.
Thanks. And we have time for one more question, please.
Hello, I'm Veronica. So I work for Climate. So I think, I don't know if I'm a millennial, but plus between 40 and 50. And I changed my career from electronics industry to renewable energy. So I am one of those techies, and we do sell a product that is sustainable in the sense that we produce power out of hot water. So we are in 3 different segments. We're in maritime, we're in industry, and I'm also in geothermal. And what I'm interested to hear your view about is, being a startup and coming with new technology and development, it takes a lot of money, and you realize that there's the subsidies out there are not always angled in your favor. Like you can have for industries, for example, I'm from Sweden, there you will have subsidies on the power. So it doesn't make business sense to install our equipment. I know here in Japan, they are thinking about, I'm just waiting for that information, will they go for subsidies? Because Japan has a huge problem to fix. If you look at maritime, you have actually regulations that will force companies to install, climate smart things to reduce their footprint, or there will be, there will be financial consequences. And then you look at all the fossil fuels and, all the aviation. And so I'm just curious, we are at 2021, 2030, we have to act now. So what are you seeing in terms of, bold decisions coming in that force companies or help companies, not both force and help companies make that change?
Well, I would look at it first off from the question of investment, which I think we're seeing this year, especially a real big recognition of the opportunity that exists because of the transition that is coming, so that investors are preparing billions of dollars to invest in startups that actually have technologies that solve those problems. At the same time, because of the Paris Agreement, and this year probably it will be concluded for Article 6, which is how emissions are traded from country to country, and NDCs start to increase the nationally determined contributions that each country makes, and to nationally determined commitments that they make to hit a particular target, that will force regulators to start to look at companies and say to them, you're going to have to replace these technologies. So the investment in that could come from the cost of carbon. There's businesses out there that are looking at their bottom lines and they're seeing that if carbon hits this price or this price, they're out. And that's going to drive the further investment in ways to replace what they're doing now.
And I would say just very quickly, there's also more financing mechanisms coming online to incentivize companies for kind of taking action. So social bonds, sustainable bonds, which you might have seen, so sustainable bonds are quite different than green bonds in the sense that if you don't hit targets, then you basically get penalized by having to pay the bondholder more money. You have to pay back. So there are things that are happening. Companies are getting better interest rates by taking action on climate. So I think in the startup world, the thing that's most interesting is you're seeing more and more funds around climate that are being originated. It's an incredibly hot space at the moment to be investing in. So I think there will be, assuming that the economy remains or starts to kind of come back a bit, and cash, we still have a lot of cash floating around. I think you're going to see more people looking to put money in that. I think our biggest fear is actually that time, because you probably know, you're in this space, it takes a long time, these technologies, and I think particularly in the technology space, there's not an appetite for investing 15, 20 years before exiting. So I think that's really, hopefully the time will speed up, right, where you can get to kind of a workable product that makes a real difference and somebody wants to buy, or that you can go you can IPO it or whatever more quickly maybe than climate technology would have in the past. So we'll have to see.
But just to come back to the carbon question real quickly, I think in the shipping business, I think they're not under the Paris Agreement, but they're starting to discuss voluntary targets that going to set for themselves, like the airline industry has done with something called Corsia. And that will probably come into play in the next 2 or 3 years. And they can actually meet those commitments by installing new technology that they can then sell on their own credits to. So there's an incentive to them to actually start making that switch. And then they look at someone who has a product like you, and they see that the investment of it actually lowers their costs, not simply in terms of their compliance, but also in terms of they could actually sell it into the market and make a profit. So I think there's probably going to be a lot of new opportunities coming online.
I think for maritime, I'm not concerned at all. We see a lot of requests for quotation from the maritime because of the regulations, and that, driven by this, that they have to replace fuel. So they want to reduce their fuel consumption and use, renewable energy. I'm more concerned about all those industries that you have subsidies in place. You're talking
about like fossil fuels being subsidized, or
either fossil fuels being subsidized, but whatever, you make sure that there's a cap on, it cannot cost too much to run your industry, so the power will be subsidized somehow. because otherwise your operating cost will be too high for your factory. That could be one thing. And then for geothermal, I think here in Japan, that's one of my challenges. Some are maybe skeptical about geothermal, so it doesn't have the same spread as solar and wind yet. But just in general to, talk openly. And I can also say for carbon dioxide, we're discussing projects where you re-inject it into the earth, basically. And those things are happening now because certain countries are so far ahead. I'm talking to Iceland, I'm talking to New Zealand, that they will push down carbon dioxide. And that's how you go climate negative, like CO2 negative. You grasp it from there and you push it back. That's one of the.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Trista. Thank you, Donald, very much. We're going to switch over to our book sales here in a little bit. Thank you very much.